Just after 6:20 a.m., on a cool September morning in 1945, the U.S. Navy transport ship slid through the fog of San Francisco Bay, its engines thudding like a slow, relentless heartbeat. On the forward deck, 127 Japanese women stood packed together, uniforms creased and stained from weeks at sea, faces hollowed by exhaustion and dread. They were nurses, clerks, radio operators, civilian staff swept up in the collapsing front lines of the Pacific, and from childhood they had been fed the same lesson over and over. Capture is worse than death. In schoolrooms back in Osaka and Tokyo, in newsreels and propaganda films, Americans had been painted as monsters who would strip prisoners, rape women, and torture them until even death was a mercy. Now, with the empire surrendered and the emperor's voice still echoing in their memory from that August broadcast, these women were living the nightmare they had been trained to resist. At the rail stood Ko Yamamoto, 26 years old, a military nurse whose hands still remembered the sticky warmth of blood on remote island field hospitals. Her fingers clenched the cold metal so hard her knuckles turned white as the fog parted and she saw America for the first time. The Golden Gate Bridge loomed ahead, that impossible orange arc rising out of the mist, and beyond it, San Francisco spilled across the hills. Rows of intact houses, shining windows, factory roofs without craters. No burned skeletons of buildings. No blackened ruins like the photographs smuggled out of Tokyo after the firebombing. Beside her, Fumiko, a 22-year-old radio operator, leaned closer. Voice barely more than air. "They will make examples of us," she whispered in Japanese. "A soldier told me on Okinawa. The Americans. What they do to prisoners." Ko didn't answer. She, too, had watched the Homefront newsreels where crude cartoons distorted American faces into demonic masks, where a booming narrator promised that to fall into enemy hands is to lose all honor. She had believed it right up until the moment on a shattered airstrip when she dropped the grenade she was supposed to use on herself and raised her empty hands instead. Now the ship's engines throttled down, and at 7:03 the hull nudged gently against the pier at Angel Island. English barked across the water between ship and dock, sharp consonants flying back and forth as sailors secured lines and lowered the gangway. To the women's ears it sounded like the clatter of stones, harsh and alien. A tall American officer with greying hair appeared at the top of the gangway, hands clasped behind his back, his expression maddeningly neutral. Was he masking cruelty or simply bored? None of them could tell, and in that uncertainty their fear multiplied. They had imagined jeering crowds, vengeful soldiers, a spectacle of humiliation. Instead, the dock below was busy but strangely ordinary. Men moving crates, checking clipboards, barely glancing up as the first Japanese women were marched down onto American soil. One by one they descended, boots thudding on the wooden planks like a slow funeral drum. Some bit the inside of their cheeks to stop their lips from shaking. Some stared straight ahead, faces frozen into masks of rigid composure. Ko felt her legs tremble as she stepped off the gangway and smelled, for the first time, this enemy land. Salt and paint, and somewhere faintly from a kitchen building on the island, the rich, warm scent of food. "This is a defeated country?" An older woman murmured behind her, unable to stop herself. The column turned off the pier and began to climb a winding road toward a cluster of white wooden buildings on the island's plateau, once an immigration station and now ringed with wire and guards. As the sun pushed through the last ragged sheets of fog and struck their faces, the women blinked against the brightness and against a realization they did not yet dare to name. Nothing here looked like the hell they had been promised. No beatings, no public shaming, no soldiers closing in with hungry eyes. Only orderly movement, clipped commands, and an unsettling calm. They had braced themselves for physical brutality. What they were walking into, without knowing it, was something far more dangerous to everything they believed. A quiet, methodical assault on the stories that had taught them who the enemy was. By 7:40 they were herded into the first low white building, the air inside cool and sharply scented with carbolic and soap. A woman in U.S. uniform waited at the entrance, not a snarling interrogator but a middle-aged WAC officer with grey threaded through her brown hair, clipboard tucked under one arm. She spoke in calm, clipped English to a sergeant, who then turned to the women and, in heavily accented Japanese, said, "Processing. Medical check. Delousing. Change of clothes. Follow." One word hit them like a slap. Delousing. In every Japanese rumor mill of the war, delousing in enemy hands had been code for public stripping, poking, cold humiliation. Ko felt her stomach twist as her group of 20 was separated and led down a corridor into a brightly lit examination room. Yet what followed did not fit any nightmare she had carried across the Pacific. 2 American female medics moved among them with practiced efficiency, checking eyes and throats, listening to hearts with stethoscopes that gleamed under the bare bulbs. They asked simple questions through the interpreter: pain, injuries, sickness. They noted scars from shrapnel and old burns, frowned over signs of malnutrition etched into thin wrists and sunken cheeks. Their faces were serious, focused, but there was no leer, no cruel curiosity. If anything, Ko thought she saw something like concern flicker in one medic's eyes as her fingers brushed the ridge of a half-healed wound. For women raised on the idea that the enemy would treat them worse than animals, this bland professionalism was almost more disorienting than open brutality. When the exams ended, they were handed plain cotton undergarments and simple work shirts and trousers in dull olive drab. The uniforms were foreign, but they were clean and whole, without patches or bloodstains. Their old clothing was taken away to be washed, not burned. At 12:05 a bell rang and they were marched to a long mess hall. The smell hit them first: yeast, roasted meat, coffee. They shuffled forward in line, metal trays clutched in shaking hands, expecting thin gruel or leftovers. Instead, ladles descended and kept descending. A thick slice of soft white bread, a mound of mashed potatoes with a square of butter melting into golden rivulets, green beans still bright in colour, a scoop of beef stew where real chunks of meat floated in rich brown gravy. Ko stared at her tray, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes saw. Behind the counter, a young American cook, no older than some of her patients had been, met her gaze briefly and gave a small, shy nod, saying in English, "Plenty more if you want seconds." She did not understand the words, but his tone held no threat. Around the tables, the women sat in frozen silence, listening to the low murmur of American voices at other tables. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Fumiko, hands trembling, lifted her fork, speared a piece of meat, and put it in her mouth. Her eyes widened, tears spilled down her cheeks. "It's real," she whispered. "It's good." The spell broke. Others began to eat, some choking up after the first bite, some devouring the food with quiet desperation. The stew tasted of salt and fat, and a kind of abundance many of them had not known since before the war ration cards. Somewhere in the back of Ko's mind, she heard her mother's voice reading ration notices, saw the charred streets of Osaka in her imagination, and felt a guilt so sharp it almost cut. Here, in the heart of the enemy, she was eating better than her family likely was in the ruins of defeat. After the meal, they were led to their barracks, long wooden buildings with rows of metal cots, each with a real mattress, a pillow, 2 wool blankets folded with military precision. Sunlight slanted in through tall windows. The floorboards were worn but scrubbed. It was not comfort as she had imagined it in a pre-war department store ad, but it was clean, ordered, decent. A WAC officer entered with the interpreter and laid out the rules. Scheduled meals, assigned work details, exercise periods, bath times. They would keep the barracks tidy. They would follow camp orders, and, she added, her eyes sweeping the room, "You will be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention." The phrase meant little concretely to most of them, a foreign law from a foreign world, but the tone was unmistakable. There were limits here, lines that even the victors had sworn not to cross. As Ko lay back cautiously on the unfamiliar mattress that night, staring at the beams overhead while whispers rippled through the dim barracks, one thought hammered in her chest. If this is how the enemy treats us, then what else have we been wrong about? Reveille came at exactly 6, a sharp bell cutting through the thin sleep of the barracks and snapping every woman back into the same jarring awareness. They were alive, they were prisoners, and they were in America. By 6:20, they stood beside their cots, beds made tight with the old automatic movements drilled into them in Japanese camps, now applied to enemy sheets and blankets. They dressed in the plain olive work clothes they had been issued, the fabric stiff but already beginning to carry the faint scent of their own bodies, making it feel, somehow, less foreign. Breakfast at 6:45 was oatmeal dusted with brown sugar, slices of toasted bread, and coffee strong enough to make Ko's hands buzz. The women ate quietly, the clink of metal cutlery on tin trays mingling with English chatter at nearby tables as American personnel cycled through the same line. There was no separate enemy kitchen, no slop pail for the defeated. Everyone ate from the same pots. After breakfast, at 7:30, came the work lists. A sergeant with a clipboard read names, and groups peeled off: kitchen detail, laundry, grounds, infirmary. When Ko heard her name, followed by hospital, her heart kicked. Minutes later, she stood at the doorway of the camp infirmary, staring at a familiar smell. Antiseptic, linen, faint sweat. It could have been any wartime clinic in Japan, except the signs were in English, and the flag outside had stars and stripes. Inside, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez waited, dark hair pinned under her cap, brown eyes alive with an alert kindness Ko was not prepared for. "You are nurse?" Sarah asked slowly, pointing to Ko's chest, then miming bandaging an arm. Ko nodded. "Hi, yes, nurse." Words were clumsy, hanging between them like stepping stones across a river, but they began to move. That first morning they worked side by side from 8 to nearly noon, changing dressings on minor injuries, checking pulses, sorting bottles of medicine with labels Ko could not read but began to recognize by color and smell. When Sarah demonstrated the American way of filling out a patient chart, she did it patiently, repeating, letting Ko copy the motions. She never once spoke to her like a criminal. She spoke to her like a junior colleague. Outside the infirmary windows, American guards walked the perimeter with rifles slung casually, their posture more bored than menacing. At 12:10, lunch was sandwiches stuffed with slices of meat, apples with unblemished skin, and cold milk poured into metal cups that sweated in the midday warmth. The first letters arrived 3 days later, delivered in a canvas bag at 16, and sorted at a rough wooden table in the barracks. Those who heard their names trembled as they took the thin envelopes covered in censor's black lines. Fumiko's hands shook so hard she could barely unfold the sheet from her mother in Tokyo. She read aloud to Ko in a low, breaking voice. "The factory is gone. The house is gone. We live in a shelter made from burned boards and tin. Food is little. Your brother is so thin. We pray you are alive. We pray you are not suffering." Around them, other women read similar stories from Osaka, Nagoya, Hiroshima, all echoing the same themes: ruin, hunger, shock. A terrible silence settled over the barracks as the sun slipped below the horizon at 18:30 and the electric lights flickered on. Ko stared at her empty hands, no letter yet from Osaka, and felt a new weight press down on her chest. She was here, with 3 full meals a day, a mattress, a roof that did not leak, working with an enemy nurse who treated her with more respect than some of her own officers ever had. Her family, if they were alive, might be sleeping on broken concrete. From her bunk above, one older woman muttered bitterly, "We are fed by those who destroyed our homes." Ko did not answer. She could not escape the more disturbing twist of the thought forming in her own mind, that sometimes the ones who destroyed could also be the ones who rebuilt, and that nothing about war was as simple as the posters had said. By the 4th evening, routine had settled over Camp Angel Island like a thin blanket, but beneath it, something raw still throbbed. It showed itself most clearly at 19, when the women lined up for showers. The bathing building was standard U.S. Army design. A big, tiled room, multiple shower heads fixed along the walls, drains running in the center. For American soldiers, this was nothing. Just another shared space where bodies were practical machines to be washed and moved on. For the Japanese women, raised on strict ideas of modesty and layered shame about their own bodies, it felt like being marched into a spotlight with nowhere to hide. On the first night, they had obeyed in silence, undressing with eyes averted, stepping under the cold spray in tight groups, shoulders hunched as if they could fold themselves smaller. Some whispered old bathhouse prayers under their breath, as if the words might stitch an invisible layer of protection over their bare skin. By the second night, Ko noticed the older women's hands shaking as they unbuttoned their borrowed work shirts. One, a former office clerk from Yokohama, stood frozen at the threshold, unable to make her feet move across the wet tile. "We must endure," Ko had told Fumiko the night before, when her friend had come back to the barracks with red eyes, lips pressed into a hard line. "It is washing, nothing more. At least the guards are women." It was true that the Americans had been careful. Only female WACs supervised bath time, standing at the entrance with clipboards, never stepping fully inside. No male guards were allowed past the outer door, yet humiliation did not need an audience. It bloomed inside their own heads, fed by years of being told that a woman's purity was her only shield against the world. On the third evening, one of the women broke down in the changing area, clutching her clothes to her chest and sobbing, "They have taken everything else. Now they take this." The supervising WAC, Sergeant Helen Patterson, watched, jaw working as if she were chewing on a problem she could not quite name. The women did not know that, later that night, at around 21:30, Patterson sat in the camp office, arguing quietly with a male officer about lumber, canvas, and whether regulations said anything at all about curtains in prisoner bathhouses. The next day, just after 1850, the prisoners filed toward the showers as usual, wrapped in the thin towels they had been issued. Ko walked with her head down, muscles already bracing for that familiar jolt of shame, and then she heard the sharp intake of breath ripple through the line. She looked up. The shower room had been transformed. Where there had been a bare rectangle of tile and exposed pipes, there now hung rows of heavy canvas curtains, each one suspended from a metal rod bolted hastily into the ceiling. Every shower head sat inside its own small cubicle of cloth, open just a hand's width at the bottom so the water could escape. The smell of fresh canvas mixed with steam rising from the warmed pipes. For a long heartbeat no one moved. They simply stared, as if looking at a mirage. Then Patterson stepped forward a little, nodded to the interpreter, and waited while he found his words. "These curtains," he said in careful Japanese, "are for your privacy. The command understands that the open showers were distressing. This is better, yes? One person, one space." His phrasing was clumsy, but the meaning landed with the force of a shell. Fumiko reached out and touched the nearest curtain, fingertips stroking the rough weave, half afraid it would dissolve like smoke. She pulled it closed and disappeared from view. From inside the stall, her voice came out thin and shaking. "They did this for us," she whispered. "They have listened to our shame." Around the room, women began to cry, heads bowed, tears cutting clean tracks through the day's dust on their cheeks. Some stepped into stalls and simply stood there, fully clothed, letting the sense of being unobserved sink in before they undressed. Ko stepped into her own narrow rectangle of space, pulled the canvas tight on its metal rings, and for the first time since capture exhaled without holding something back. Hot water spilled over her shoulders, beating a rhythm against her skin, and she pressed her forehead to the cool tile, letting the roar of the pipes drown out the sob breaking loose in her chest. This was just fabric and metal, she told herself, just a few hours' work by some American carpenters, and yet it felt like an acknowledgement so deep it left her dizzy. The enemy had not only fed and housed them, the enemy had chosen to protect their dignity when no one would have blamed them for ignoring it. That thought burned more fiercely than any humiliation she had imagined on the long voyage across the Pacific. That night, long after lights out at 21, the barracks did not settle into its usual uneasy silence. The air felt different, charged in a way Ko could not name. Women lay in their bunks staring at the shadows on the ceiling, replaying the rough feel of canvas between their fingers, the shock of being unseen while naked and vulnerable. Around 22:30, in the dim space between cots, a small cluster gathered near Ko's bed. Fumiko, Yuki, the telegraph operator, 2 younger nurses, and one woman who had once worked as a schoolteacher in Kyoto. They spoke in whispers so soft the words were more breath than sound. "It is dangerous to think too much," the teacher warned, old habits of censorship still strong. Remember what they told us. The enemy will try to soften us, make us doubt. But Yuki clutched a folded letter in her hand, edges already soft from being read and reread. My sister says the Americans in Tokyo share food with children, she murmured. She says they help rebuild, that they are strict but not cruel. When I read that, I thought she was confused or being watched. Now, she let the sentence trail off, eyes drifting toward the barracks door as if she could see straight through it to the shower building. Ko had begun keeping a diary that morning, using paper and a pencil issued by the camp at 10 when a clerk had asked, almost casually, "Do any of you wish to write?" The first page held only a few lines in careful characters. "We are prisoners of war. We are in the hands of those we were told were beasts. Yet they feed us, clothe us, and today they shielded our shame with simple cloth. Who are they really?" Now, as the whispers swirled around her in the dark, she felt the weight of that question settle heavier on her chest. "Maybe this is all a trick," one older woman hissed from the upper bunk, unable to hold back. "They want us to go back home and spread stories of their kindness. It is propaganda, just like ours." The word stung because it hit something true. Ko thought of the newsreels she had watched in crowded Japanese theaters, grainy black and white images of American cities, allegedly in flames, of caricatured faces and triumphant slogans. She remembered the swelling music, the collective breath of the audience, as they were told their sacrifice was crushing a decadent enemy. Here, standing in an intact American camp, she could feel those images crumble like ash. A week later, on a Sunday at 9, the camp chaplain announced that religious services were open to anyone who wished to attend. No one forced the Japanese women to go. No one threatened punishment if they stayed away. Curiosity, more than faith, pulled Ko and a handful of others to the small wooden chapel at the edge of the compound. They slipped into the back pews, keeping close together, as American soldiers and nurses filled the benches ahead of them. Sunlight poured through simple glass windows, painting pale rectangles on the floor. The chaplain, an older man with a tired but gentle face, spoke in English, and beside him a bilingual Nisei interpreter rendered his words into halting Japanese. The sermon was about enemies, not about crushing them, but about loving them, about how war did not erase a person's humanity. "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you," the interpreter translated, stumbling slightly over the strange reversal. Ko listened, every nerve taut. Here was a man whose flock included soldiers who had lost brothers on Saipan, on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, and he was telling them not to cling to hatred. After the service, outside in the crisp late-morning air, Sarah found Ko near the steps. She touched her own chest lightly and said, "American," then pointed to Ko and said, "Japanese," then brought her hands together, fingers interlocking. "Not enemy. People." The words were simple, the grammar broken, but the meaning struck like a hammer blow. That evening at 20:15, back in her bunk, Ko opened her diary again. The pencil hovered before she finally wrote, "Today I heard the enemy's holy man say we must love those we fought. Today an American nurse told me I am not her enemy, only another person in a war neither of us chose. If they see us as human, what does that make the stories we were told?" Around her, the barracks hummed with low arguments, older women guarding their hatred like a last piece of armor, younger ones like Fumiko staring at the ceiling with eyes shining in the dark, as if seeing a new world map only they could read. The idea that the Americans might not be monsters was no longer just a frightening thought. It was becoming a fact they could touch, in bread, in blankets, in curtains. In the quiet way, someone on the other side of a gun chose to treat them, as if their dignity still mattered. The final crack in Ko's old world came on a grey October afternoon around 15:10, when a young American private hobbled into the infirmary with his ankle twisted from a training drill on the far side of the island. He sat on the exam table, jaw tight, eyes flicking uneasily toward Ko as she stood beside Sarah, ready with bandages and notes. While Ko wrapped the ice pack in cloth, he muttered in English, thinking she wouldn't understand. "Ma'am, she's Japanese. My brother died on Iwo Jima." The name of the island hit the air like a gunshot. Ko didn't catch every word, but she recognized Japanese and Iwo Jima, and the grief in his voice needed no translation. Sarah paused, finished securing the bandage, then looked the boy straight in the eye. "Your brother fought so you could live in a world better than that island," she said firmly. "She is a nurse. The war is over. You honor his sacrifice by choosing something better than hate." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking clock on the infirmary wall. Then, slowly, the private turned his head toward Ko and really looked at her, not as a symbol, but as a tired woman in a borrowed uniform whose hands were steady on his injury. "Thank you," he said in halting, careful words, forcing each one out. "For helping." Ko bowed her head automatically. "You are welcome," she answered in broken English, the phrase feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. After he left, Sarah laid a hand briefly on Ko's arm. "You are good nurse," she said. "Good person. Friend." The last word slipped past Ko's defenses like a blade of light. That night, at 21:45, she wrote in her diary with shaking hands, "Today the enemy's soldier thanked me. Today an American nurse called me her friend. The enemy has fed me better than my own army did. They respect my body more than my officers ever did. They hung curtains to protect our modesty. If those who defeated us treat us more gently than those who led us, what does that say about our war?" The repatriation orders came in November, typed in neat black letters, and read aloud in the barracks at 10:31 windy morning. Ships would begin returning prisoners to Japan in December. The word home rippled through the room, not as pure joy, but as a complicated ache. Fumiko sat on Ko's bunk that evening, twisting the corner of her blanket. "I should be happy," she whispered. "I should be counting the days, but I am afraid of ruins, of hunger, of what they will think when they hear we were treated well." Ko nodded. She too had seen the change in the women's faces, color back in their cheeks, a little weight on their frames, eyes that no longer had the hunted stare of the newly captured. They had healed in a place they were supposed to fear. How do you return to a country and say, "The people we were told to hate fed us, mended us, and gave us privacy in the shower"? The first group left on a cold December dawn at 6:10, breath steaming in the air as they boarded the ship, clutching small bundles of belongings and hidden memories. Fumiko was among them. At the dock, she grabbed Ko's hands. "Tell Lieutenant Martinez thank you," she said, tears spilling freely now. "Tell her she changed everything. Tell her I will remember the curtains." When Ko's turn came weeks later, Sarah met her at the infirmary door with a small photograph taken by a borrowed camera, the two of them standing side by side in front of the clinic, half smiling, winter light glancing off their caps. On the back, in looping English script, Sarah had written, "To Ko, my friend and colleague, may you find peace at home. Remember, war does not decide who we are. Our choices do. We choose kindness. Angel Island, December 1945. On the ship back across the Pacific, sometime after midnight, when most of the other women were sleeping, Ko stood alone at the railing, the wind cutting cold through her coat, the lights of America dwindling into darkness behind them. She thought of rice, ration cards, and burned streets waiting ahead in Osaka, of suspicion, of the heavy silence that would greet any story that didn't match the old propaganda. She also thought of hot stew in a mess hall, of a chaplain preaching love for enemies, of a young soldier swallowing his grief long enough to say thank you, of a nurse who had called her friend, and of plain canvas curtains that had turned a room of shame into a place where a prisoner could stand upright again. Years later, in a quiet post-war Japan reshaped by occupation and recovery, Ko would sit in a small living room with grandchildren at her feet, and, when they asked about the war, she would not start with battles or bombs. She would begin with Angel Island and the day the Americans hung curtains in the showers. "We were the enemy," she would tell them softly. "They had every right to ignore our shame. Instead, they protected it. Real power is not the power to humiliate. Real power is having the chance to be cruel and choosing kindness instead." And somewhere far away, on an island in San Francisco Bay, the wind would still rattle the eaves of old wooden buildings where, for a brief moment in 1945, 127 women learned that even in total war, humanity can survive behind a strip of canvas and a decision to see the person, not just the uniform.